Ryan Thomas with East West here, and welcome to the official walkthrough for Hollywood Fantasy Percussion, which is the next installment in our groundbreaking Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra series. Now, you've actually heard some of these instruments already if you've seen the other walkthroughs in this series, but basically, this library is a carefully curated and beautifully recorded selection of percussion instruments that have just become emblematic in the fantasy genres, like the taikos and the iconic Celtic bodhrán. Now, we're going to explore the individual instruments so that you can hear what they sound like by themselves, but then we're going to break down the soundtrack that you heard at the beginning of this video so that you can hear how these can be used in context. So let's go ahead and start right up at the top with the bodhráns. And these are pretty versatile, but I think they make the ideal sort of mid-range driving percussion element. And these are also beautiful with just the close mics for like a tavern setting in a fantasy video game or something like that. And I should point out that many of these instruments include rolls and flams and other mainstay articulations, so you can make these percussion lines very colorful and authentic. Next, let's check out the Gran Casas. And these, of course, are just iconic. They're going to be ideal for those big, dark, low, booming hits. And just the way that these were recorded, I think gives them a very Lord of the Rings vibe. Now, some of the larger percussion instruments in this library, like the taikos and the Gran Casas, feature both a regular and a low tuning. So just for reference, here is the regular tuning, and then here's the low tuning. And speaking of the taikos, let's go ahead and check those out next. And these were just so perfectly recorded. I think they really capture the essence of this instrument. Now, just like with the other Hollywood Fantasy series instruments, Hollywood Fantasy Percussion does also include moods, which are basically going to affect the mic mixes, the impulse responses for the internal reverb, as well as the dynamic response curves. So here are the taikos again in the classic mood, just for reference. And then here they are in the epic mood. And then in the soft mood. So there's just a lot of variation in the sound that makes these very versatile. All right, now here are the 600-pound Nagatos, and these are just going to be ideal for those classic, epic, low, booming hits, and these are just so incredibly rich. Let's hear these in the epic mood. Then we have the crotales, and these are just iconic fantasy. They are very magical, and I think they also layer beautifully with harp. All right, now the cymbal and gong ensemble cover pretty much all of the bases that you need to cover with these instruments, but the flavor is decidedly fantasy. So here are just some of the sounds. And next we have a patch that combines the goat nail shaker, the metal shaker, the crackheads, and the chang changs. So basically a lot of your high driving percussion elements. So here's the goat nail shaker, and this one just has a really cool kind of Witcher vibe to it. This is the metal shaker. And then these are the krakebs. And then we have the chang changs. And these ones I think are very special. They work really beautifully as kind of a driving element underneath the percussion section. I typically just use them on the beat, especially if it's a faster tempo. Now, the Nagara rub effects can be used, I think, in a similar way to the gong effects that are in some of our other percussion libraries. So they've got this very dark, ominous character. So yeah, really ideal for, those tension and suspense cues, and these can be really effective over just a very simple drone. Okay, next up, let's check out the Nagara and Ashiko. And these are very versatile, I think, but I like to pull these out when I need a more varied and colorful percussion line. These also have a really cool vibe in the soft mood, really ideal for like a tension cue or something like that. And it is difficult to express my enthusiasm for the new orchestral bell ensemble. These were just so perfectly captured. So yeah, depending on the context, I think these can either sound just lush and magical, or they can sound brutally dark. Now, speaking of brutally dark, let's check out the orchestral metallurgy next. And this is definitely one of the coolest, most unique percussion patches I've come across in a long time. And I think these would just be perfect as like a thematic signature sound for an orc horde or something like that. And then in the lower range of the keyboard, you have the low and the high waterphones. So again, just such a unique, cool patch, and I think it fits really beautifully with the fantasy percussion ethos. So next, let's check out the snare ensemble. And these have such a beautiful, epic stereo field, but they still sound very clean and defined. All right, and then finally we have the toms. And once again, you have this big cinematic sound, but they're still very clean and punchy. So that pretty much covers all of the individual instruments in the library. And while I think it's very important for you to be able to hear these instruments by themselves so that you know exactly what you're getting, I think with percussion specifically, it's also somewhat difficult to really appreciate them until you hear them in context. So let's go ahead and play that clip that you saw at the beginning of this video again, but without any of the sound design, and then we'll break it down. So here it is. So obviously, I had a lot of fun with this one. It's probably one of the more experimental soundtracks in the Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra walkthrough series. Not a lot of melodic content. This is mostly just going to be a texture-based soundtrack. So let's go ahead and just start right up at the top. And I want to solo the percussion first. So you just have this gong hit here, and then you have these big hits in the nagatos and the large taikos. And, there isn't a lot going on in this section. We're just kind of building some textures. And then the only other elements in this intro are from Hollywood Fantasy Strings. And you have the low strings on this low E, and you've got the viola da gamba playing this tremolo. It sounds so cool by itself. That is a great texture for building tension. And then you have a line in the Hardanger fiddles. And I've actually applied an amp to this. So this is just the Legend amp in the Opus player, and you can see all of the settings right here. And that gives it a really cool vibe. And then you have the lute tremolo coming in here at measure 4. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. So again, very simple writing here. We're just kind of building these textures. And I should point out, by the way, that that roll going into this next section is just from the Grand Casas. So let's go ahead and check out the next phrase. And here you've got the opposing armies kind of preparing themselves for battle, steeling themselves for what's about to go down. So we just needed to build the suspense, to build the tension. So we're starting off with these hits in the orchestral bell ensemble, the Nagara rub effects, and then, of course, the taikos and the nagatos. So here is what that sounds like. That Nagara rub effect just really makes this section very cool vibe. And let's go ahead and skip forward a little bit. So then you have these layered hits in the taikos and the nagato ensemble. Those just sound really great together. And you also have these random hits coming in the chang changs around measure 7. And then another chime hit, and you've got this hit in the orchestral metallurgy. So that's really pretty much all that's going on in this section in the percussion. Then in the strings, you have some textures carrying over from the previous section, but we're also adding an amped viola da gamba tremolo, and that sounds like this by itself. And I'm going to go ahead and show you the settings that I have for the amp here. Again, that's just the Legend amp in the Opus player. And that is also going through a pitch shifter in Logic that's mixing in 50% of the sound an octave down, so that's how you're getting that lower octave. Basically kind of creating this really cool pad out of the tremolo viola da gambas here. And you just get such a great vibe. And I should point out that that's being sent to a stereo ping pong delay, as well as, of course, plenty of reverb. And we're using the Abandoned Abbey from Spaces 2, which is a really, really perfect reverb for this kind of vibe. So let's go ahead and hear the strings with the percussion. Here you've got the lute tremolos coming in. And then some tremolos in the high strings as well. So that's already getting pretty close, but we also have a line in the Renaissance flutes as well as some vocals. And I should point out that I am sending a lot of that Renaissance flute signal to a stereo delay. It's just a simple dotted eighth stereo delay. So that almost becomes more of an effect than an instrument. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. And that roll going into the next phrase that you heard is one of the low-tuned taiko rolls. So let's go ahead and check out the next section. And the writing here really couldn't be any simpler. You've got this war horn effect that's pretty much dominating the entire soundscape. And that's created by layering these low strings with the alpenhorns, which are kind of the core of this texture, and then the Wagner tubas. So that sounds like this. Such a great vibe for this part, where the armies are kind of staring each other down. And then in measure 15, you do have these Wagner tubas coming in to crescendo to the next part. Then the only other element here is going to be the percussion. And I think the two main instruments in this section are going to be the orchestral metallurgy and the large taikos. And I should point out that I do have a different mic mix for these than in the other taiko patch. I just have more of the close mic mixed in because it just felt better for this section for some reason. And then you also have the chang changs that are kind of helping to drive things along. They're playing on the beat here. And then you have these massive hits in the 600-pound Nagato ensemble. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. So that orchestral metallurgy really fit for this part, and it just really helped to add to the kind of gravity of these two armies, staring each other down. Now, in this scene where the armies are kind of yelling and charging at each other, there was already so much going on in the sound design that I had to be really careful with the music. So it actually needed to be pretty subtle, at least at the beginning of this scene, but then it does build as the armies are kind of charging at each other. So we're introducing two new textures. We've got some amped viola da gambas, but I've also added some distortion. I'm using this fuzz unit in the Opus player, and you can see all the settings here. And that sounds like this by itself. So of course, the higher you push that with the mod wheel, the more distortion you're gonna get. And then we also have a hurdy-gurdy drone coming in as well. So these are both going to add a really cool vibe to this section. And then, of course, we have the amped Harnagar fiddles playing this line here, as well as the amped viola da gamba that you heard earlier that also has this pitch shifter mixed in. Now, in the percussion, we're starting this section off with a really big gong hit, followed by these toms that are just kind of sneaking in at the beginning, and then they crescendo all the way through. And you've got these low pulses in the taikos that are also crescendoing, along with a sustain roll in the gran casas. So let's go ahead and hear this whole section with the percussion, the strings, and the brass. And now we are in the battle itself. And visually and in the sound design, there's just a lot of chaos. So part of my strategy for reflecting that chaotic vibe in the soundtrack was to alternate between a 5/4 and a 6/4 time signature each measure. And I found that by doing that, it made the musical phrasing very difficult to predict. So we're introducing some rhythmic elements in the strings, and you've got these beautifully sharp spiccatos in the viola da gambas, along with these really chunky shorts in the low strings. And then we're carrying over some textures from before. So you've got these amped viola da gambas playing this lead line here, as well as the amped and distorted viola da gambas playing these notes here, and they are basically a drone in this section. Now at measure 25, you have the high string tremolos coming in, and I'm also passing these through the Legend amp in Opus, and they sound like this. So really cool texture there. So let's go ahead and hear the strings by themselves. really fun texture building. Let's go ahead and check out what's going on in the percussion. And the taikos are kind of dominating the rhythmic pattern here, but then you also have these chang changs, which are playing on the beat, and they're giving us that nice resonant darkness that is just creating such a cool atmosphere in this section. And then you have the metal shakers that are really driving things along, and these are being sent to a stereo delay. It's just a standard dotted eighth delay, and those sound like this by themselves. So you get kind of a cool chaotic effect with that delay. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. Now we're adding 3 new percussion elements in this next section. You've got the barans, which sound like this by themselves. And then we're also adding the nagara and ashiko. And those are just infusing a ton of energy in this section, especially when you hear them in the context of the full percussion. Now we're actually developing a melodic motif for the first time in this piece, and that's starting in the Hardanger fiddles, and then it's being passed to the viola da gambas. So here's what that sounds like. And then that motif is actually going to pretty much continue in the viola da gambas through the rest of this fight scene. And then we're adding a couple more textures here. You've got the spiccato viola da gambas that are also going through the Legend amp, kind of giving us this chugging effect. So that's really helping to drive things. And then we're also adding the lutes and the dulcimers. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together, and we'll start a few bars out so that you can get that transition into this section. Now, in the next part of this fight scene, we actually have something of another melodic motif coming in the low brass and the strings. And I think it's just a really fun example of what Hollywood fantasy brass is capable of. It's just so incredibly massive, but it's also clean enough to sit really well in a dense mix like this. Now we're also introducing the toms in the percussion section. This is a really effective way to help this section build even more. And they're playing this rhythm. And then the low hits have traded off from the grand casas to the taikos and the nagados. Now, if you'll notice, the rhythm in the low drums is kind of fighting with the toms there. And I typically wouldn't advise doing something like that, but in this case, because this scene needed to feel so chaotic, I think having those rhythmic clashes kind of actually helped to further that goal. Now, besides that, the percussion section is pretty much carrying on like it was before. So altogether, it sounds like this. And it pretty much just carries on like that through the rest of this phrase. And then the only other thing that I should point out is that you do have this line in the high strings coming in at measure 45. And I'm just using the high strings patch from Hollywood Fantasy Strings. And they just really soared in this section. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. So we're definitely breaking some rules here, but at the end of the day, if it feels right, just go with it. Now, in this next section, you've got these big dramatic hits in the high and low strings and, of course, the percussion. So there is a good bit of layering going on here. You've got the taikos, the chang changs, and the snare ensemble, and they're all playing the same rhythm. And then about halfway through at measure 54, they're being joined by some cymbal crashes in the cymbal and gong ensemble patch. So let's just hear the strings with the percussion here. And then you do also have something of a melody in the uilleann pipes as well as the Hardanger fiddles. So let's go ahead and just solo those together and hear what they sound like by themselves. And then that's pretty much it, aside from some of those distorted pads that we made out of the viola da gambas and the high strings, as well as some tremolos in the lutes and dulcimers. And then about halfway through this phrase, we do also have the Wagner tubas coming in to kind of crescendo us out of this section. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. So those snares are just really making those big hits pop in the mix. And they were just so perfectly recorded, especially for this kind of an application. Now in this last section, you just have some very light percussion. You've got these hits in the orchestral bell ensemble. That was just the perfect vibe for this phrase. And you have some light hits in the taikos, a couple of vocal phrases, and then in the strings, the movement is being provided by the 3 dulcimer patch, and there's also a tremolo in another dulcimer patch. And you have the low strings just holding out a single sustain. You have the amped viola da gambas, and the only thing that's really playing melody here are the non-amped viola da gambas. And then around measure 61, you have the high strings sneaking in on this line. So let's go ahead and just give it a listen. And then, of course, we're finishing out with that roll in the Gran Casas. So that is going to conclude this walkthrough. It's such an incredibly cool library, and it just complements the other libraries in the Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra series so well. It is a really powerful collection of instruments. So, of course, this is available as a standalone product, but it's also just part of the Composer Cloud Plus subscription. So if you're a subscriber, you already have access to this library. So if you liked this video, don't forget to like it, drop a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.